Hello, everyone. So, this is a video about presidency, demographic, and personal characteristics. So, the word demographic is derived from Greek, demos meaning people, and graphia to describe or to write, and personal characteristics. So, what we want to do here is to describe personal characteristics of presidents in order to reflect on what they say about ourselves. What do presidents that we choose reflect back to us and tell us about some of our most important characteristics? So if you looked at all the presidents who have been elected through 2025, you see that only 45 people have served as president of the United States. And currently, as I record this, Donald Trump is president. He is the 47th president. So we have had 45 people serve as president, but we have had 47 presidencies. And this is because Grover Cleveland and Donald Trump are the only ones who have served two non-consecutive terms, so they count twice. And President Biden, who was president before Trump, was the 46th president, and Trump is both the 45th and the 47th. So what are some of the characteristics that they either share, all of them share, or most of them share? So all presidents were men. The United States is one of the few remaining democracies that never had a woman as top leader. Many have actually gone through multiple women leaders. Great Britain would be one example. So wherever you look in the world, you will see that there's been a woman leader of a democracy, whether it's South America, North America, like in Canada, Kim Campbell, and of course in South America, Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, Cristina Kirchner in Argentina, and you had Golda Meir in Israel. You had also Indira Gandhi twice in India, Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan, Tansu Çiller in Turkey. So in other words, you see the pattern. And in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote overall by almost 3 million votes over Donald Trump. But of course, we count popular votes state by state and then translate that into electoral college votes. So Hillary Clinton never became president. I think we are not too many years away from women becoming president of the United States. But one never knows these things. So all but one were white. All were Christian except Thomas Jefferson, who was a deist. So Jefferson was born into an Anglican family in Virginia, of course, in 1743, and he grew up an Anglican. But as an adult, he was a deist, so he believed in a God who created the universe but was uninvolved in human affairs. After Truman, all had a college degree. Truman tried several times but dropped out of college each time. So, of course, Truman was elected in 1948. So figure this out. So for the last almost 80 years, every president has had at least a bachelor's degree, and most of them had an advanced degree like a JD or an MBA. All were middle-aged or old? Yeah, that's true. So, as most people know, JFK was the youngest one elected at 43, but the youngest person ever to become president was actually Teddy Roosevelt, who ascended to that office in 1901. In September of that year, President William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist, Leon Czolgosz. And as his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt ascended to the presidency. All except Trump had prior governmental experience. This led some people to believe, their names will be unmentioned, that Donald Trump would never become president when he first ran in 2015-2016, because history was very clear on this point. The pattern was unmistakable. While Trump had many years of dealing with government because of his business as a real estate developer, it's not the same as being on the inside and understanding and experiencing how the government works from the inside. So a lot of people believed Trump would not be able to pull it off, and he had to slice through 16 or 17 other competitors to get the Republican nomination. which was a tall order. So the thinking was the insiders, those with government experience like Ted Cruz or Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio, would have a significant advantage just because of that factor. But of course, the people who thought that way were proven wrong in 2016. So to kind of round this off, like I said, Cleveland and Trump have been elected to 2 non-consecutive terms, Cleveland in 1884 and 1992, and Trump in 2016 and 2024. And as I'm recording this, we're still 3 years away from the next presidential election. So anything can happen. And I would say there are no clear front runners. But if one were to guess, it would be J.D. Vance or Ron DeSantis on the Republican side, and perhaps Gavin Newsom on the Democratic side. But like I say, 3 years is an eternity in presidential elections, so we don't really know. Disturbingly, we have created presidential dynasties. So one of the points of the American Revolution was to get away from monarchy. But we have created kind of a substitute monarchy, and this is evident in close relationships that some presidents had to each other. So we had 2 sets of father and son, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, okay? So the 2nd and the 6th president. So of the first 6 presidents, already we had father and son, right? So 2 out of 6. 33% were already father and son right off the bat, very early on in the country's history. And then we got our second father and son dynasty in the 20th and 21st centuries. So we have George Herbert Walker Bush. Late in the 20th century, he became president in 1989 after winning in 1988. And his son, George W. Bush, who won or was awarded presidency by the Supreme Court, depending on your position. I'm not taking issue. So George W. Bush became president in 2001, and they were presidents 41 and 43, respectively. Then we had one set of grandfather-grandson, and this was William Henry Harrison and his grandson Benjamin Harrison. So the 9th and the 23rd president. William Henry Harrison had the shortest presidency in office. He died of pneumonia after delivering his State of the Union address. The weather was cold and stormy, and he got a cold which escalated and then eventually became pneumonia, and he died weeks into his presidency. But yet Benjamin Harrison, and Harrison is the one who split the Cleveland's term into non-consecutive ones. Cleveland would be defeated in 1888 by Benjamin Harrison, but then would win re-election in 1992. We had second cousins, James Madison, the 4th president, and Zachary Taylor, the 12th president. And of course, we had distant cousins, Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the distant cousins belonged to different political parties, interestingly enough. Donald Trump has, at least for now, stopped, if not ended, the 2 presidential dynasties, and that's the Bush dynasty and the Clinton dynasty. So in 2016, Jeb Bush, former governor of Florida, was considered a pretty strong candidate to win. He had a lot of money. He had a lot of traditional interests, Republican constituents backing him. But Trump was able to defeat him very easily, and then less easily Hillary Clinton. So Bill and Hillary Clinton have only one daughter, Chelsea Clinton, and she does not have real political ambitions. But she has 3 children, so who knows? And on the Bush side, you had Jenna and Barbara Bush, who are the daughters of former President George W. Bush. But as far as I know, they don't have political ambitions. So it's safe to assume that at least for now, for the coming decades, these 2 dynasties have stopped. But who knows? A marquee name can always come back and haunt us, because we, vest so much emotional energy and credibility and credence into name recognition. So I cannot guarantee that there will never be another President Bush or another President Clinton. Successful versus failed presidents. This is a bit subjective. So there are different criteria, and this is on the intersection of history, political science, and sociology, obviously. Some historians use a lot more elaborate criteria. I only have 4, so how well or badly the president performed in crisis, such as wars, economic recessions or depressions, very difficult international negotiations. The second criterion is how effective was the president in working with Congress in getting things done. In other words, was he able to articulate a policy vision and then persuade the legislative branch to adopt a good portion of it? 3, to what extent was the president able to minimize corruption within his administration? And 4th, how and to what extent the overall legacy is assessed based on what the president has accomplished. And this 4th factor explains why it was too early, for example, to evaluate Donald Trump, because his presidency still continues and his legacy is still not a legacy. It hasn't been fleshed out yet. And even with President Biden, his departure from the office is still quite recent. So even in his case, and given that we still do not know everything about his failing health in the last years of his presidency, who was controlling access to him, who was making decisions in the last years and months. So that is still very much under development. And so we cannot yet rank Trump and Biden, is what I'm saying. So almost every credible historian would say that these presidents are among the top 10, Lincoln, Washington, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And typically these 3 are among the top 3. Now Lincoln, because he had the difficult task of putting the country back together after it had fallen apart. So the South seceded from the Union, starting with South Carolina in December of 1860, and then Confederate States forming Confederate States of America by March of 1861. And so Lincoln decided that the South would be invaded and conquered. And basically, this is what happened. As you know, Lincoln paid with his life for this decision. He was assassinated by a pro-Southern sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth, who was himself from a border state of Maryland, but a state that, while loyal to the Union during the war, had slavery and had a lot of pro-Southern sympathies. So Lincoln is said to have saved the Union and to have ended slavery. And he did so despite personal struggles with things like depression. So he's among the top 3. Then we have George Washington, because he's the one who started all of this. And he's said to have set the precedent of only 2 terms. He could have been president for life, but he decided to retire. However, we should note that he had serious health issues by the time he retired. But still, I know a lot of leaders around the world throughout history who, even though they were very sick and decrepit, still decided to hold on to power. So I think some degree of credence should be given to this argument that Washington established a precedent whom several people tried to break, like Ulysses Grant, didn't get his party's nomination. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke. So presidents after Washington tried to win a 3rd term, but they all failed. And also, Washington was a good manager. He allowed Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson to work in the same administration and still be productive, even though Hamilton and Jefferson didn't particularly like each other. And Washington was able to listen to other people's advice. He was open-ended, and he respected the fact that other people, like the aforementioned Hamilton and Jefferson, had more education, more formal education than he did, and to a significant extent were more sophisticated. But he was secure enough to listen to other people and to take advice when he thought this was prudent. And then we have Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And this was the first and only president who won not just a third, but also a fourth term in office. He was never defeated for this office. He had to be carried out in April of 1945 in a coffin out of the White House. So what happened was Roosevelt shepherded the country through first the Great Depression and then the Second World War. And he did so successfully. I'd say the Depression was over by 1941. Unemployment fell from its peak of 25% in 1932 to about 10-11% by 1941. So his programs ended the Depression. And I think by the time the Second World War ended, we had some of the historic lows in the unemployment. So Roosevelt is considered among the great presidents for this reason, and he did all that while being in a wheelchair. He contracted polio as an adult, and it paralyzed him from waist down. So he is considered among the great presidents. Then there's more controversy as to who is included and who is not included among the top 10. Teddy Roosevelt, for his involvement in the establishment of the national park system, in his regulation of monopolies, trust busting, his lack of fear when standing up to big business, the nouveau riche, trying to regulate corporations, to help out the workers, for his energy and vision as president. Then Harry Truman, because he was incorruptible. So there have been presidents whose administrations were drowning in corruptions, and there were presidents whose administrations were almost free of corruption. So Harry Truman belongs to that latter category. And also Harry Truman ended the Second World War. Today it's controversial. Today the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 is very controversial. And if you were to look at public opinion surveys, they're split about 50-50. But back then it was not controversial. The vast majority of Americans supported this when they were informed of this after the fact, because Japanese had not been surrendering even after their cities were firebombed repeatedly. More than half of Tokyo was destroyed by the repeated firebombings, most famous of which is a March 10th firebombing. But so Truman is considered that. And also because Truman did not run for a third term. This is an interesting wrinkle because the 25th Amendment, which actually set the limit on how many terms one can run for president, Truman was excluded from this limitation because that amendment specifically stated that it does not apply to whoever holds the office at the time. So Truman, who served out the remainder of Franklin Roosevelt's term and who was elected in his own right, could still run for president again in 1952. And he would have a good chance, but he just decided not to run. And then you had Thomas Jefferson, who is sometimes among the top 10 because he nearly doubled the size of the country with Louisiana Purchase. An interesting footnote, Jefferson did not think that he actually could buy land from a foreign leader. In this case, it was Napoleon Bonaparte, but he did so anyway. And so the size of the United States increased significantly because of him. Presidents were occasionally ranked among the top 10. Eisenhower, whose stock has risen in recent decades. Kennedy, whose stock has fallen in recent decades. Ronald Reagan, Andrew Jackson, and James Madison, although I would not put Madison in the top 10 because of the War of 1812, which the United States nearly lost when British captured Washington, D.C., and they also captured New York City, and they held New York City like through the end of the War of 1812. So they held it like, I think, till 1815. And James Madison had to flee from Washington. He was able to do so about an hour before the British came and burned down the White House. I think some serious mistakes were made during the War of 1812. So I would not put Madison in the category of the top 10. even though he is, of course, considered the father of the Constitution and the father of the Bill of Rights. But it is what it is. All right. If you're going to say that we have successful presidents, you also have to say, well, we have failed presidents. Now, who are they? James Buchanan, Warren Harding, Ulysses Grant, Andrew Johnson, and Herbert Hoover are almost universally described as failed presidents. And George W. Bush, more often than not, although George W. Bush is ranked slightly better in virtually every survey than, the other five that I have listed here, because of his ability to be relatively more persuasive. So with Congress, relatively more successful in working with the legislative branch. But given his program, that doesn't make me rank him higher, because the other things that he did, like starting a war in Iraq on false pretenses and encouraging reckless residential lending for residential real estate lending, calling for ownership society, which in my opinion led Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to back mortgages which they should not have backed. This created the real estate bubble, which then set us up for the real estate collapse in 2007, 2008, and a major recession that began in December of 2007 and would not end until mid-2009, with unemployment effects lingering much longer. So, this is a very soft science, you see, political science. So I would not rank George Bush lower or higher than these. I would put them with the rest of these failures, but just to let you know, others tend to still put him as a failed president, but not as failed as these others. So James Buchanan lacked appropriate leadership. He was too passive. He thought the issue of slavery could be solved by the Supreme Court. Man, was that a terrible mistake, terrible underestimation of what the court was actually going to do, which was to inflame racial tensions. Just 3 days after Buchanan said that the Supreme Court would resolve the issue. So March 7th, 1857, in Stanford, I see I'm having problems thinking today. Dred Scott versus Stanford, the Supreme Court made things worse. And also James Buchanan, partly because, he was thinking that the issue of slavery was not likely to rent the country apart, decided not to raise an army of any significant size. So the militias of the North and South Carolina were larger than the regular U.S. Army in 1860, when Lincoln was elected and South Carolina seceded from the Union. So James Buchanan was really underprepared, and he misunderstood the situation that existed in the country. Warren Harding was, by many accounts, spineless, and Warren Harding's administration, partly because of that, was drowning in corruption. Ulysses Grant was also supervising a corrupt presidency, where he appointed people to positions who were corrupt. Andrew Johnson, because he couldn't do much. This is partly not his fault. He had to work with Congress, which was dominated by radical Republicans who hated him. But Johnson wasn't able to push any significant agenda through, and he's also considered failed because of how the Reconstruction went. He issued a lot of pardons. He pardoned virtually everyone who came to him from the slaveholding aristocracy and asked for a pardon. Andrew Johnson enjoyed doing so, enjoyed having them come to him and grovel before him, because he came from very humble background. And he himself, after he rose financially in life, he actually was able to acquire a few slaves, but he always disliked and even despised the aristocrats, the slave-holding aristocrats, whom he, I think, held responsible for the Civil War, which I think is a fair assessment, that a small percentage of the population of the South was able to plunge the entire region into secession, and that eventually led to the Civil War. Herbert Hoover, because he didn't act decisively enough in the early years of the Great Depression, so he was voted out of office. And then George W. Bush for things that I have already mentioned. Personal characteristics. Now, most presidents share all of these five: ambition, energy, flexibility, intelligence, and vision. And this is especially so in recent decades. In order to even get elected president, you have to be very ambitious. Now, in the past, this was not necessarily so. Warren Harding was not all that ambitious, but he could not say no to his friends. And when they asked him to run for president, he did. In today's world, when you do have to face the primary election season, and when politics has become so publicly dirty, so openly dirty, it has always been a very dirty business, as we discussed with the election of 1800 between Jefferson and Adams. But now it's all out in the public because of television and the internet. And you really have to be able to put up with unnecessary psychological brutality if you want to run and win. Energy. Yeah, because campaigning is physically and mentally draining. If you don't have a lot of energy, it's unlikely that you will succeed. Not just as president, but even getting, you see, to the presidency. And once you're in office, your day never ends because there's always something to do. There's always things that come up because of the multiple responsibilities that the president has, as we already discussed. There's never enough time in a day for you to address everything. And if you want to be successful, you better have a lot of energy. Flexibility. This one factor is often misunderstood and even maligned. I would say that you have to be flexible. And people who don't like this, they say, well, you're wishy-washy. Bill Clinton has often been labeled that way. But I think part of why Clinton is not a failed president, but rather is somewhere in the middle, is because he was able to be flexible when it was necessary. After the healthcare reform failed, he was able to pivot. So he did not dig in his heels. He understood what the situation in the country was, and he became very cooperative with the Republican agenda. So he and his wife Hillary, who was designing the healthcare reform, they abandoned it, seeing that, okay, it's not going anywhere. And Clinton pivoted toward working with Republicans on things like NAFTA and things like welfare reform. And I'm not saying whether these things are good or bad as policies. What I'm saying is that Clinton had flexibility enough to recover his popularity. Then 2 years later, in 1996, win re-election overwhelmingly over Bob Dole, and to kind of keep an eye on the economy, whereby the economy didn't falter but only kept improving. And we had the internet boom between 1996 and 1999. We had our first and so far only budget surpluses in the late 90s. Then we have intelligence. I would suggest that all presidents have been intelligent, even the much maligned George W. Bush, who was definitely intelligent. It's just he seemed to have been willfully ignorant from time to time, especially on crucial issues like that you couldn't conquer a country simply because you wanted to and you thought that others would accept your soldiers as bearers of goodwill, hence will in fact be greeted as liberators. So I think his misunderstanding of the situation in the Middle East, the culture, the ethnocultural politics of that region has let him down, and he bought into the neoconservative agenda, which I do not think he had when he ran for president. I think when he ran for president, he probably had a much more conventional Republican view of foreign policy. But the neoconservative regime change thinking is probably something that was not his idea, is just something that he took from others. But with regard to original intelligence, you see, I would say that only 3 presidents were original deep thinkers: Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Woodrow Wilson. Others were intelligent, like I said, but they were not known for their deep originality, like James Madison. James Madison was a great organizer and a great compiler of information, but not a particularly original thinker. And then if you also take others, like George Herbert Walker Bush, very, very good practical intelligence based on his experience as a fighter pilot, ambassador to China, director of the CIA, but also, again, not a particularly original thinker, and on you go. Vision. Where there's no vision, people perish, according to the Proverbs. So where there's no vision, presidencies perish. So take again George Herbert Walker Bush, a relatively successful president in his first and only term, but he could not win re-election and was defeated by Bill Clinton, who stormed out of nowhere, was a nationally unknown character in 1991, and then in 92 defeated a worldwide phenomenon of George Herbert Walker Bush, because Clinton offered a vision of a more multicultural America with government being more involved, and et cetera, et cetera. So he said, I feel your pain. He wanted to reform the economy. Of course, the ill-fated healthcare initiative in the long run proved unhelpful to him politically, but Clinton had, or he at least could convince people that he had a vision, and that vision was better economy. Remember James Carville, who managed his political campaign in his office, had this banner, "It's the economy, stupid," apparently to remind himself and his staffers that the economy is what matters. And George Herbert Walker Bush did not have a vision for the country. His vision came down to, we have a new world order now, and most people do not care about these abstractions, especially if these abstractions are about foreign policy. People care a lot more about their situation at home, here at home, and this is how elections are won or lost. So the more of these 5 a person has, and the more pronounced these 5 are, the more likely that that person will be a successful president. All right. Now, assassinations also tell us a lot about ourselves as a society, not just about presidents who had the tragedy of being assassinated. If you look at how many there have been assassinated, there's been only 4: Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. There have been many assassination attempts, including some presidents surviving multiple assassination attempts. Donald Trump, the current president, is an example. But also there have been others. Gerald Ford, who only served president for 2 years, actually survived 2 assassination attempts within days of each other, and both were by women. I have a separate lecture on assassinations and assassination attempts, and they do tell us a lot about the patterns of assassins and would-be assassins. And they tell us these patterns that are both psychological and patterns that are political. But to briefly introduce this topic, what I can say is some assassins and would-be assassins are clearly motivated by politics. Some do not seem to be motivated by politics. So the ones who were clearly motivated by politics was Leon Czolgosz, who assassinated President William McKinley. Czolgosz was an anarchist, and we know that his political views drove his heinous act. That's without question. We also know that in case of Charles Guiteau, who assassinated President Garfield, this was not political, as far as we can tell. This was personal. And Guiteau resented that Garfield did not appoint him an ambassador to either France or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so he ambushed him and mortally wounded President Garfield. That is psychological. That's not political. And then there are assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln, where there's a good probability that it was both political, but also could be psychological. For example, in case of Abraham Lincoln, we know John Wilkes Booth, there was a very, very strong political element. But that is not to say that there was no psychological element too. But in this case, we see that the political element was strong. And Booth was a Confederate fanatic. And psychological element is weak because we cannot say much about it. Booth lived at a time when modern psychology did not exist as a field, and modern psychiatry did not exist. And so we cannot diagnose him based on the DSM. With John F. Kennedy, the psychological aspect is strong, and the political aspect that may have been here is weak. And we see that with Lee Harvey Oswald, you definitely had a personality disorder, in my opinion. He was diagnosed with passive-aggressive elements in age 13, and later this would be developed into passive-aggressive personality disorder, but then this disorder is no longer, it's now in the appendix. In the current DSM-5 TR, text revisited, that's not considered a personality disorder. Lee Harvey Oswald's personality most closely maps onto ASPD, antisocial personality disorder, with passive-aggressive elements, which are prominent in covert narcissism. So if one were to speculate what might have happened in a situation like this with Lee Harvey Oswald, one would probably say, well, this is really ASPD with NPD, possible NPD comorbidity, or at least strong NPD traits. But the disorder that fits his behavior the most is ASPD. So these are some of the basic elements of presidential demographics. Thank you. I'll see you in the next lecture.